My starting place in thinking about the Kentucky River is the North Fork in Hazard in Perry County. I've been hanging out on those banks as a regular thing for over 40 years by now. The town and the river have always been compelling places for me to visit, to study and think about, to regain a sense of origin and place after years of separation, to relive the sights and sounds of my early life there. I first began paying attention to the Kentucky River as a kid living in Allay's coal camp at the edge of Hazard. In those days, the late 30s and early 40s, the North Fork was a source of recreation. There were still clean sandy beaches and deep holes for people to swim in. On summer Sundays, people would gather there by the score to enjoy the water and the sun. That changed, of course, as the quality of the river water declined and the mountain towns began to get swimming pools. As far as I was concerned as a kid, this stretch of water was the beginning and the end. This was the Kentucky River. I had no concept of how far the river went or that Hazard is 30 or more miles from the true source of the river. The farthest reaches of the Kentucky River headwaters can be traced to just below this spot, Pound Gap, on the border between Virginia and Kentucky. It's here where the river begins its ageless journey. With notable deviations, the river follows a general northwestward course through the heart of Kentucky. In a straight line from its headwaters on the crest of Pine Mountain near Whitesburg to the river's end at the Ohio near Carrollton, it's a distance of 172 miles. But in its meandering course, the main river and its largest fork, the North Fork, add up to 420 flowing miles. In its entirety, the Kentucky River Basin embraces nearly 7,000 square miles. But to know the river, you must start in the mountainous headwaters region of eastern Kentucky, an area drained by the three major forks of the river whose sources reach back to the crest of Pine Mountain. It's here on Pine Mountain that the first waters of the Kentucky River seep from the limestone rock and ledges. It is literally thousands of rivulets like this which feed the creeks that form the headwaters of the Kentucky River. One of my favorite things to do when I'm in the mountains is to set out to find the sources of streams and their confluences, to scout along the branches and the creeks, and watch the smaller flow into the larger. To come across a location like this one is a real satisfaction. It is right here in Leslie County that the waters of Spruce Pine Creek and Dry Fork Creek swirl and mingle to form the middle fork of the Kentucky River. At the confluence of any two streams, a special feeling and set of thoughts come to mind. One is reminded of how flowing water organizes the land and how the shape of the land so strongly influences the ways in which people organize themselves upon it. The steep hills of this land cause most of the early roads to run close to these watercourses. Sometimes the creeks were the roads. In some places, they still are. As you travel through the remote and isolated locations along the forks of the Kentucky, you quickly get a sense of that old relationship between road and watercourse. This relationship is fast fading in modern times as road builders now cut through whole mountains to lay their blacktop. Every time I find a new creek or confluence of creeks, I feel as if a piece of a puzzle has fallen into place. As I visit these places one by one, I have come to see how coherent the whole river system is, how orderly the natural arrangement is, and how disorderly our human use of land and water often is. To come to know the order and coherence of a natural system is more than an esoteric exercise. To know the lay of the land and the courses of flowing water is to have the beginnings of personal coherence in one's own mind. It's invigorating to be familiar with the natural organization of things. I think people feel less anxious about things in general if they have a picture of the world in mind and their place in it.
Thank you, Bobby Lynn, for that fine song there called Joshua. We want to send that out to my wife and Bobby Lynn's mother over there at the Kmart and all her friends.
Even though modern times have inundated the mountains as thoroughly as they have any other place, still the older life continues in some measure on many of the creeks and hollows. Such is the case of Kingdom Come Creek, a tributary of the North Fork, lying in the shadow of Pine Mountain. My friend Herbie Smith, a filmmaker with Appleshop, a film cooperative in Whitesburg, descends from people who have lived on Kingdom Come Creek since the mid-1800s. In the early settlement years, when people of European descent first took up land and established homes in the Kentucky mountains, families tended to occupy particular creeks and coves and farm for their livelihoods. A deeply rooted common culture developed around this unique creek, or holler life as it is sometimes called, and the disruptions caused by the arrival of industry in the mountains were painful to bear. Even as industry brought the first real cash economy to the mountains and irrevocably connected the mountain people to the larger industrial world. Herbie took us to his family homestead to see the direct effect one of these industries, strip mining, has had on the land and water system.
They took a big bulldozer and built it across through here. And then they were catching the water back in this part.
I see.
And then as the water would slow down with all of the silt in it, then all of the stuff would just settle down in here. So what you've got is,
Oh, I see. So
this is where the water used to be. There was a pond right here.
this is the bottom of an old silt pond.
Well, this is the level where the water came up to. There might be 10 feet of water here, and now there's 10 feet of silt or whatever it is.
So this was a branch that used to run off this mountain.
Right.
What was it called? You remember?
Well, I think on the old maps they called it Peavine.
Uh-huh.
But like most of these hollers around here, they always named it after the person that lived at the mouth of it and owned the whole holler usually.
I see.
In this case, it was Drew Frazier's branch, they always called it, who was my great-grandfather. He was born in a log house down there.
Yeah.
And lived there all of his life, and he died there in the 50s. But there was this little branch that came all the way off. It drained this whole part up in here, Drew Frazier branch.
Yeah.
And then when they stripped up here, they had to do something about the runoff, you know, because there's always a problem with these strip jobs having tremendous amounts of pollution that are coming off of them into the water stream.
Right.
And so they built a silt dam right over there. And so they dammed up this little branch and had a pond here.
I see.
And then as the water would come off of the strip job and slow down, then the silt would settle out of the water.
Yeah.
And then the water would, you know, there was an outlet for the water going out. But eventually, what was a pond became filled up with silt. So that we're now probably standing on about, I don't know, I would say at least 7 or 8 feet of silt.
I get it.
That came off that strip job.
It has been over 10 years since the mining was done on Herbie's family's land. But the scars are still there, as they are all over the mountains. Mountains and streams that took millions of years to create have been forever changed.
For a long time, people have been abusing the land. And what's happened is that we now have these machines that just give unlimited power to radically change the place. That power we can't somehow control as a country. We don't have the psychic restraint to have some kind of understanding of the balance that we need to achieve in trying to use this land as human beings and preserve it for generations to come.
During one of my many rambles through the headwaters region, I determined that I would organize myself so I could explore the entire river, one section at a time, in different seasons and weathers. To begin this journey, I wanted to run a stretch of the river in the spring, beginning on the North Fork just below Jackson to where the three forks come together near Beattyville, then ride the main channel all the way to Valley View, a few miles south of Lexington. I particularly wanted to get on the North Fork during the spring runoff season, so I could get some idea of what it was like in the early days of the logging industry in the mountains, when men rode huge log rafts out of the hills to the downriver mills, catching the tide, they called it. The loggers would have felled the big trees the previous fall, then tied them together in huge rafts, often behind what they called splash dams, and waited. Waited for the water to rise and fill the low bottom land where they assembled the rafts. When the water was high enough and fast enough, they would load themselves and supplies on board and cut the raft loose. Those were exciting times on the river, which lasted well into the early part of this century. The rafters planned their runs for months. They studied the weather and the water for days leading up to their launch time. I would have done well to do the same. I tossed my equipment into the canoe and launched it all in mad urban haste, my mind only half present to consider what I was actually doing. And that was a big mistake.